Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? We're going to be talking about something really important today. We're going to be discussing black children with disabilities and the kind of inequalities that they face in the American education system. It's a heavy topic, but hopefully you'll stick with us because knowledge is power.
Absolutely. And that's kind of our mission today, not to just weigh you down with a bunch of statistics and data, but to really pull out those key insights that will equip you, the listener, to understand this very complex problem. We're going to be talking about why these kids face so many barriers and how policies, big policies like IDEA actually fall short, and then why simply scrapping the Department of Education, which some people think we should do, isn't going to just magically solve the problem.
Okay, so we've got a stack of research and reports in front of us, even a really powerful call to action from one of the sources. So let's unpack this, huh? One thing that really jumped out at me, like right away, is this statistic. It was from the NCLD report. They said black students are 40% more likely to be labeled with a disability than other students. 40% more. That's a huge red flag, right?
Incredibly concerning, yeah. Especially when you start to break it down by disability type. Black children, they're disproportionately identified with things like emotional disturbance, we call it ED for short, and intellectual disability, or ID, but then actually underrepresented when it comes to autism. It's like it makes you wonder, are the labels themselves part of the problem?
Yeah, it's like, are these labels really accurate reflections of what's going on? Or is there something deeper? I mean, could it be that systemic bias in the education system is playing a role? Because I was looking at this research from Grindle and their team, and they really point in that direction.
Yeah, for sure. One of the really fascinating things about Crindle's research is they found that racial disparities, specifically in special education identification, those persisted even when you factored in income. So it's not just a poverty issue. Black students from non-low income backgrounds, they were twice as likely to be identified with ID or ED compared to white students from similar backgrounds.
Whoa, twice as like, I mean, that's a huge discrepancy. And just think about the domino effect, right? Like if a kid is mislabeled, they might end up getting the wrong kind of help. They might miss out on opportunities that they should have. It's like setting them up for failure from the start, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And this really brings us to another important aspect of this, the role of families. I mean, families, they're supposed to be these empowered advocates for their kids. But the reality is much more complicated, especially for marginalized families.
Yeah, the Cultivating Family Empowerment Report was a real eye-opener in that regard. Like, it's not just about parents wanting to be involved. It's about the system itself. Like, creating barriers. Imagine you're a parent, juggling multiple jobs, childcare. Maybe you're dealing with language barriers too, and then you're thrown into this world of special education with all this complex legal jargon and these intimidating meetings. It would be so overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's a system that's pretty much designed for privilege. A lot of families, they just don't have the time or the resources or even the cultural understanding to really navigate it effectively, so they're already starting at a disadvantage.
And even when schools try to like bridge that gap with things like interpreters, there's this whole emotional layer that can get lost in translation. Cinco's research talked about that. It's not just about conveying the word, it's about conveying the nuance. Like a parent's love and concern for their child.
Yeah, precisely. And, that missing piece can lead to all sorts of problem and misunderstandings, missed opportunities for real, genuine collaboration. And ultimately, it just leads to further marginalization of these families.
So where do we go from here? If these problems are so like ingrained in the system, are there even solutions? The family empowerment centers or FX, those seem like at least a step in the right direction.
Yeah. FX, they offer a really promising approach. What I find really fascinating about them is, they go beyond just providing information. They actually train families. They train them to be effective advocates, give them the tools and the knowledge to actually navigate the system themselves.
I love that. That's great. It's like the old saying, teach a man to fish instead of giving him a fish, right?
Yeah.
It's about empowering families to fight for their kids' rights. But even with FXEs, I mean, are we still just kind of putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, FX, they're valuable, don't get me wrong, but they can't single-handedly fix a system that's riddled with systemic bias. We need more sweeping change that really addresses those root causes of these disparities. And that's actually where Cheryl Poe's article in the 74 comes in.
Yeah, her piece was a real call to action. She's basically saying that black parents, advocates, activists, They all need to be louder, bolder, file complaints, demand accountability. They need to make sure their voices are shaping education policies. It's about taking ownership, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And what's really important to understand about Poe's perspective is she's speaking from a historical perspective. She talks about how the labeling of Black children as disabled is rooted in slavery, Jim Crow, and these racist beliefs about their capacity to learn. So we're not just talking about a modern problem. We're talking about something that's woven into the fabric of our history.
Wow. That's powerful and incredibly disheartening. So if we're talking about dismantling these like deeply seated biases, some people, and I've heard this a lot, some people argue that we need to dismantle the Department of Education entirely. They say it's like the root of the problem. What do you think about that?
I think it's an oversimplification, honestly. Dismantling the DOE without addressing those underlying causes, the systemic racism, implicit bias, inadequate funding for support services, it would be like, putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. You're masking the problem, but you're not healing it.
Okay, so it's not about tearing the whole system down. It's more about like rebuilding it, making it more equitable. And that includes, all these things we've been talking about, empowering families, addressing funding disparities, and really tackling those deeply embedded biases head on. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is. But, recognizing the complexity of the problem, that's the first step.
Okay, so let's talk more about some practical solutions in a bit. But first, I want to kind of shift gear for a second and share a really powerful story. I think it illustrates the struggle for disability rights in general. Have you ever heard of the Capitol Crawl of 1990?
Ah, yes. A pivotal moment in the disability rights movement really captures that struggle for equality and the power of collective action.
So picture this. People with disabilities, they're frustrated, they're fed up with inaccessible public transit, and they literally abandoned their wheelchairs, their crutches, everything, and crawled up the steps of the U.S. Capitol building. It's an image that's just seared into my memory. Looking at those photos, I can feel the desperation, but also the determination in their actions.
Yeah. And what's so powerful about the Capitol Crawl is it really forced people to confront the reality of disability and the barriers that are faced by people who are often, marginalized, ignored. It wasn't just about transit. It was about demanding equal access and inclusion in all aspects of society.
Right. And this happened just 2 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act was finally passed. Do you see any parallels between the Capitol Crawl and other civil rights movements?
Oh, absolutely. The struggle for disability rights, it shares a common thread with, the civil rights movement, the fight for women's suffrage, the LGBTQ plus rights movement. It's all about fighting against prejudice, systemic barriers, all these things that prevent people from fully participating in society.
It strikes me that all of those movements had those really powerful moments of protest, activism, the kind of moments that shifted public opinion and forced change. And the Capitol Crawl seemed to fit right in with that legacy, that legacy of fighting for justice and equality. But even with legal victories like the ADA, the fight's not over.
Right. I mean, legal protections are only as strong as their enforcement. And the Capitol Crawl is a powerful reminder that we can't be complacent. We need to be vigilant, demand accountability, and continue pushing for a more inclusive and equitable society for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context, the need for ongoing advocacy, but let's kind of circle back to those practical solutions for a bit. We mentioned family empowerment centers, but what other policy ideas are out there? I mean, specifically to address these disparities for Black children with disabilities. I know the NCLD report had some interesting suggestions.
Yeah, it did. One really promising avenue is implementing more evidence-based frameworks. Things like multi-tiered systems of supports, MTSS, universal design for learning, UDL, and positive behavioral interventions and supports, which is PBIS. But it's also really important to make sure that teaching is culturally responsive as well. These approaches, what they aim to do is create inclusive learning environments. Environments that benefit all students, but are particularly important for addressing the needs of students who might otherwise be marginalized.
Okay, so break those down for me a bit. What do those frameworks actually look like in a classroom? I'm thinking about the listener here, trying to make this really concrete.
So imagine a classroom where instead of having that one-size-fits-all approach, the support is actually tailored to each student's unique needs. That's NTSS in action. And then you have UDL. That's about creating flexible learning experiences, catering to different learning styles, different abilities. It's about recognizing that not everyone learns the same way, and that's okay. And then there's PBIS. That one focuses on proactively shaping positive behaviors rather than just punishing negative ones.
Got it. So it's about creating a learning environment that's supportive, that's adaptable, and that celebrates different ways of learning. I like that. But how do we make sure that those frameworks are implemented in a way that's, culturally sensitive? And that actually addresses those deeply ingrained biases that we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's where culturally responsive teaching becomes absolutely essential. It's about, first of all, recognizing and valuing the diverse cultural backgrounds of all of the students, making sure that the curriculum reflects those diverse perspectives and creating a classroom environment where everyone feels seen and respected. And another really important factor is diversifying the educator workforce. Having more teachers of color, that can make a huge difference in creating a more inclusive and equitable learning environment, especially for Black students.
That makes sense. Representation matters, both in the curriculum and in the people who are leading the classroom. But even with like the best intentions, and all these great frameworks in place, what about the kids who are already struggling? The ones who are being mislabeled, maybe pushed into restrictive settings, facing harsh discipline. How do we fix those immediate problems while we're working towards those long-term systemic changes?
Well, the NCLD report, they had some specific recommendations for that too. They basically called for improvements to the special education eligibility process. They argued that the current system relies too heavily on subjective judgments, which, can be easily influenced by bias. So we need more objective assessment tools and better training for educators, to really minimize that risk of mislabeling.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's about making sure that kids are being identified for the right reasons, not because of someone's implicit bias, but what happens after they're identified. How do we make sure that they're getting the right support, that they're not just being pushed aside?
Yeah. So the report, it goes beyond just identification and placement. They advocate for a shift in school culture, moving away from punitive measures and more towards restorative practices. Think of it as repairing harm and building community rather than relying on punishments, which often disproportionately impact students of color.
Yeah, I like that. I'm picturing a classroom where conflict is seen as an opportunity for understanding, for growth, not as a reason to isolate and finish. But shifting that culture, that takes a lot more than just changing policies, right?
Absolutely. It requires buy-in from everyone, educators, administrators, families, and the community as a whole. It's about creating a school environment where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued, regardless of their background or their learning differences.
That's a beautiful vision. Let's keep exploring how to make that a reality as we continue our deep dive. Now, I want to kind of dig into some of the data from the OSIP Fast Facts report. It had some really striking information about specific disability categories and the disparities that we see.
Yes, that report really paints a clear picture of the problem. For example, the overrepresentation of Black students in the emotional disturbance category is particularly concerning.
Why is that category so worrisome?
Well, think about it. In the criteria for emotional disturbance, it's often subjective, very open to interpretation. And that subjectivity, that opens the door for bias to creep into the decision-making process. So are Black students truly experiencing more emotional and behavioral challenges than other students? Or are they being unfairly labeled because of preconceived notions, because of a lack of cultural understanding? That's a question we really need to grapple with.
Right, it's like, are we misinterpreting behaviors because of cultural differences? Or are we like attributing something to a disorder when it's actually a normal response to trauma or stress? It's unsettling to think about how deeply ingrained bias can shape these decisions.
Absolutely. And that's where the need for culturally responsive training becomes so crucial. We need educators who are equipped to understand how cultural differences might manifest in behavior, who can recognize trauma, and who can respond with empathy and support, not punishment.
Okay, so it's about challenging those knee-jerk reactions and asking ourselves, like, what's the context here? What am I not seeing? But the OSIP report also pointed out something else that caught my attention. The underrepresentation of Black children in the autism category. That seems like a different problem altogether.
It is a different problem, but it's equally problematic because if Black children with autism are not being accurately identified, they're missing out on those crucial early intervention services. And those services, they can make a world of difference in their outcomes.
Wow. So we're talking about a system that might be over-identifying some kids while completely missing others. What factors are contributing to this under-identification of autism in Black children?
Well, there's several layers to this problem. One is a lack of awareness and understanding of autism within the Black community itself. Cultural stigma surrounding disability can also play a role. And then, of course, there's the issue of implicit bias among educators. They may not be as attuned to the unique ways autism can present in Black children.
So it's not just about training educators to recognize autism in general. It's about training them to recognize it in all its diverse forms, across all racial and cultural groups. But it's also about addressing those systemic barriers that might prevent families from accessing those diagnostic services in the first place, right?
Right. Think about things like a lack of culturally competent providers or long wait lists. Financial constraints, all these are obstacles that disproportionately impact Black families who are seeking diagnoses for their children. So we need to make those services more accessible and equitable if we really want to ensure timely identification and support for all children with autism.
Yeah, it's a reminder that this isn't just about fixing schools, it's about fixing a whole system, a system that creates these barriers in the first place.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the core theme of this whole deep dive. Educational equity, it requires a systemic approach. It's not just about tweaking a few policies, it's about dismantling those deeply ingrained beliefs and practices that just perpetuate inequality.
It's a daunting task, but I guess acknowledging the problem and understanding its complexity is that first step, right?
Absolutely. And, that's why conversations like this are so important. By shedding light on these issues, by digging into the research, by sharing stories and perspectives, we're moving the needle towards a more just and equitable education system for all children.
And speaking of stories, I want to kind of shift gears for a moment and talk about a concept that really resonated with me from the source material. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Ah, yes. ACs, really crucial to understanding the challenges faced by many Black children with disabilities. We're talking about things like poverty, exposure to violence, family instability, all these traumatic experiences that can have a profound impact on a child's development.
And the NCLD report pointed out that Black children are disproportionately exposed to ACEs, and that can make them more vulnerable to being, misidentified or underidentified for special education services, right?
Exactly. It's like adding another layer of complexity to an already incredibly complex situation. ACEs, they can really exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and make it even harder for these kids to access the support that they need.
So it's not just about their disability, it's about the context of their lives, right? The challenges they're facing outside of school, the trauma that they might be carrying with them. How do we create a system that takes all of that into account?
That's where the need for a more holistic approach comes in. We need to move beyond this narrow focus on academics and recognize that a child's educational success is intertwined with their social, emotional, and physical well-being. We need to see the whole child.
It's about addressing the whole child, not just the disability label. But how do we actually do that? How do we build a system that provides that kind of wraparound support?
It takes a collaborative effort. We need educators, healthcare providers, social workers, community organizations, all working together to create a truly integrated system of care, a system that addresses the holistic needs of the child and their family.
Yeah, that sounds like a massive undertaking, but it's clearly essential if we want to create a system that truly supports all children, especially those facing the greatest challenges. Now, let's dive a little deeper into the role of implicit bias. We touched on it earlier, but the research from Beneki and their team, they really highlighted how pervasive it is within the education system.
Yeah, implicit bias, it's a crucial issue to confront. It refers to those unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that we all carry, even if we don't consciously endorse them. And those biases, they can have a huge impact on how educators perceive and interact with Black children with disabilities.
And I think this is even true for, well-intentioned educators, the ones who are truly committed to equity. It's not about accusing anyone of being racist. It's about recognizing that we all have these ingrained biases that we need to be aware of and actively work to dismantle.
Exactly. It's not about blame, it's about awareness and accountability. And, the research really suggests that those biases, they can manifest in these very subtle ways, like lowered expectations, differential treatment, a tendency to pathologize Black children's behaviors. It's a recipe for perpetuating inequality.
So it's about constantly questioning our assumptions, checking our biases, and making sure that we're treating all children with the same level of respect and the same level of expectation.
Absolutely. And that requires ongoing professional development, self-reflection, a willingness to confront our own unconscious biases. It's not just a one-time training. It's an ongoing process of growth and learning.
But it's not just about individual teachers, right? It's about addressing those institutional policies and practices that perpetuate bias. Things like disciplinary procedures, curriculum design, even the physical environment of the classroom can all contribute to inequity.
You're absolutely right. It's about creating a school culture that is intentionally anti-racist, where diversity is celebrated and where all students feel a sense of belonging.
That's a big picture goal. But it starts with small, intentional actions every single day. Now, I want to talk about something that might seem like a small detail, but it actually plays a huge role in perpetuating inequities, and that's language and communication.
You're hitting on a really crucial point there. As we talked about earlier, language barriers can create significant obstacles for families who are navigating the special education system, but it goes beyond just providing interpreters. We need to be mindful of those cultural nuances in language, avoid jargon, and really use clear, respectful language that everyone can understand.
Right. I mean, even if you have an interpreter, certain phrases, certain expressions, they might have misinterpreted, or even offensive in different cultural contexts. And we need to be open to different ways of communicating, right? I mean, some families might express themselves through storytelling, through nonverbal cues, or by involving extended family members. It's important to be sensitive to that.
Absolutely. It's about creating a space where families feel comfortable sharing their perspectives, where their voices are genuinely heard.
It's about moving beyond just checking boxes. It's about building relationships, building them based on trust and mutual respect. But even with the best intentions, there's this inherent power dynamic between educators and families, right?
Yeah, there is. And that power dynamic can be especially pronounced for Black families, who may already be facing systemic racism and discrimination in other aspects of their lives. The PowerPoint slides experiences of marginalized families source. They talked about these power blocks, these things that really make families feel powerless.
Yeah, and those power blocks, they can show up in these subtle ways, like assumptions about a family's knowledge, a lack of transparency in decision-making, even just a condescending tone of voice. It could be intimidating, especially if you're already feeling marginalized by the system.
Absolutely. And that's where cultural humility comes in. Educators, they need to approach these interactions with a willingness to listen, to learn, and to acknowledge their own position of power. They need to see families as equal partners in this whole decision-making process, not just passive recipients of services.
It's about recognizing that families, they're the experts on their own children, and their voices deserve to be heard and respected. But sometimes, even when we try to create a more equitable system, we hit these roadblocks. And that's where advocacy comes in, right?
Exactly. Advocacy is crucial for challenging systemic inequities and for holding institutions accountable. Cheryl Poe's article, the one in Education, a Civil Rights Issue for Black Students with Disabilities and Families, that was a powerful example of that.
Yeah, she talked about how her organization, Advocating for Kids, filed a complaint against the Virginia Department of Education because they saw systemic violations of students' rights. It's a reminder that we can't just sit back and hope things will change on their own. We need to actively push for justice and accountability.
Absolutely. And, advocacy, it can take so many forms. It can be attending school board meetings, organizing community forums, contacting elected officials, all these things. It's about making sure that the voices of Black students and families are heard and that their experiences are taken seriously.
And it's about supporting organizations like Advocating for Kids, the one who are fighting for systemic change. It's a collective effort, and every voice makes a difference. But beyond fighting for rights and resources, how do we ensure that Black students with disabilities, how do we ensure that they're empowered to advocate for themselves?
Yeah, that's how the concept of self-determination comes in. And the PowerPoint slides source, they really emphasize the importance of this, especially for students who have been historically denied agency and control.
So it's not just about adults making decisions for them. It's about equipping them with the tools and the skills to make choices about their own education, about their own life.
Precisely. It's about teaching self-advocacy skills, creating individualized transition plans that really align with their goals, and fostering a school culture that values student voice and agency.
It's about recognizing that these students, they're not just passive recipients of services, they're active agents of change. And that empowerment, that starts early, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to the importance of trauma-informed practices, especially when we're working with Black children who, as we know, are disproportionately exposed to those adverse childhood experiences. The Confronting Racism and Bias Within Early Intervention source, they had some really valuable insights on this.
Okay, so what do trauma-informed schools and classrooms actually look like?
They're environments that understand the impact of trauma on learning and behavior. They recognize that behaviors like like hypervigilance or withdrawal or difficulty regulating emotions, those are often a response to trauma. They're not a sign of defiance.
Okay, so it's about meeting those behaviors with empathy, with understanding, not punishment.
Exactly. Trauma-informed practices focus on creating safety, predictability, and trusting relationships. And they equip students with coping skills and provide support to help them process and heal from trauma.
It's about recognizing that those traditional disciplinary methods, those can actually re-traumatize students who have already experienced trauma. We don't want to do that.
Precisely. Trauma-informed schools prioritize restorative practices and those positive behavior supports that really address the root causes of behavior, rather than just reacting to the symptoms.
It's about creating a learning environment that is both academically stimulating and emotionally supportive. I like that. But how do we ensure that that environment also affirms the cultural identities and experiences of Black students with disabilities?
That's where culturally sustaining practices come in. The Reconceptualizing Assistance for Young Children of Color with Disabilities source, they drew on disability critical race theory and really emphasized this point. They argued that traditional approaches to special education, they can be culturally incongruent and even harmful for Black students.
So it's not just about being inclusive. It's about actively celebrating and incorporating Black culture into the learning environment. Make it a part of the everyday experience.
Exactly. Culturally sustaining practices that might include things like incorporating Black literature and history into the curriculum, using culturally relevant teaching methods, and just creating a classroom environment that reflects the diversity of the student body.
Right. It's about recognizing that Black students with disabilities are not a monolith, right? They have diverse interests, different learning styles, different cultural experiences, and all of that needs to be acknowledged and valued.
Precisely. It's about creating personalized learning experiences that honor each student's individuality while also affirming their cultural identity and sense of belonging.
So we're talking about building a system that's both academically rigorous and culturally responsive. A system where Black students with disabilities can thrive in all aspects of their being. But that system, it can't be built without the active involvement of families, can it?
Absolutely not. Families, they are essential partners in this work, and we need to make sure that they have the support and resources they need to advocate for their children and to contribute their unique knowledge and perspectives.
And that's where those family empowerment centers, those FECs that we talked about earlier, that's where they come back into the picture.
Yes, they do. FECs, they play a crucial role in empowering families to navigate the complexities of the special education system. They provide information, they provide training, support, and they often have staff members who share the cultural backgrounds of the families they serve. And that shared understanding, it can make a huge difference in building trust and communication.
So FECs, they're not just providing services, they're building bridges between families and the education system. They're empowering families to be active participants in their children's education. But how do we ensure that those efforts are actually making a difference? How do we know if we're moving the needle on equity?
That's where data comes in. We need ongoing data collection and analysis to monitor progress, identify areas where disparities persist, and hold those schools and districts accountable for addressing those disparities.
Right, and it's not enough to just collect the data. It needs to be disaggregated. Disaggregated by race, ethnicity, disability category, and other relevant factors. Otherwise, we're just getting this surface-level view. We're missing those crucial nuances.
Exactly. And that data, it needs to be transparent. It needs to be accessible to the public. Families, communities, advocates, they all need to be able to see the data, analyze it, and use it to hold systems accountable for creating real, measurable change.
So it's about creating this culture of data transparency and accountability, where the data is not just sitting in a report somewhere, but it's being used to drive decision-making, to inform policy changes, to track progress over time.
Precisely. But collecting and analyzing data is just one part of the equation, right? We also need rigorous research to help us really understand the complex factors that are contributing to these disparities and to develop evidence-based solutions.
And that research, it needs to be collaborative. It needs to bring together researchers, educators, families, and community members. It can't just be academics in ivory towers studying the problem from a distance.
Absolutely. The most effective solutions are the ones that are grounded in the lived experiences of those who are most affected by the problem. We need to value the expertise of families, educators, and community members, the ones who are on the front lines of this issue.
So research is not just about generating knowledge. It's about using that knowledge to inform action and create real, lasting change. Now, as we kind of wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of, wow, there's so much work to do, but also this glimmer of hope, knowing that there are solutions out there and people are fighting for change. What about you?
Oh, I share that feeling completely. This work, it's complex, it's challenging, and often it's heartbreaking. But it's also incredibly hopeful because within these conversations, within these research findings, within the stories of resilience and advocacy, I think we find the seeds of a more just and equitable future.
Yeah, I agree. And as we move into the next part of our deep dive, let's keep those seeds of hope planted firmly in our minds. Let's explore what it means to move beyond awareness and into action, to translate all this knowledge into tangible change for Black children with disabilities. Join us for part 2 as we continue this crucial conversation.
Welcome back. It's great to continue this conversation. It's really important.
Yeah, it is. And, before we dive back into all the research and stuff, I just wanted to acknowledge how much we've already talked about. The history, all that data, those systemic barriers. It's a lot to take in. I feel like it's important to sit with this discomfort for a bit, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's really easy to just kind of shy away from these difficult conversations. But, that feeling of discomfort, I think, is actually a good sign. It means we're engaging with something that really matters, something that deserves our attention and ultimately our action.
I think you're right. Okay, so we were just talking about hope, right? And the importance of remembering those stories of resilience and resistance. And I feel like that ties in really well with what I want to explore next, which is the role of culturally sustaining practices, specifically in empowering Black students with disabilities.
Oh, that's a great segue. As we delve further into potential solutions, I think it's so crucial to remember that we're not just talking about fixing a broken system. We're talking about building something completely new, something that really honors the unique identities and experiences of these students.
Yeah. The source on reconceptualizing assistance for young children of color with disabilities, that one really challenged me to rethink my assumptions about what good special education actually looks like. They talked about how those traditional approaches, they could be so culturally incongruent and even harmful, especially for Black students.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating about that source is how they draw on disability critical race theory, or DISCRIT for short, which basically pushes us to examine how race and disability, how those things intersect to create these really unique forms of oppression. It's a framework that really demands that we center the voices and the experiences of people who have been historically marginalized. Marginalized by both racism and ableism.
Okay, so if those traditional approaches aren't working, what does a culturally sustaining approach actually look like in practice? I mean, I'm trying to picture it. What would that look like in a classroom? I'm imagining a classroom that not only welcomes diversity, but celebrates it, makes it a core part of the learning experience.
Exactly. Imagine a classroom where Black literature and history aren't just relegated to a single month, but they're woven throughout the entire curriculum, where teaching methods are adapted to incorporate diverse learning styles and those different cultural backgrounds, and where the physical space itself, the classroom, reflects that richness and beauty of Black culture.
It sounds like creating a learning environment where Black students feel really seen and heard and affirmed, not just, tolerated.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that their Blackness, it's not a deficit to be overcome. It's an asset to be celebrated and nurtured. And it's also about acknowledging that Black students with disabilities, that's not a monolithic group. They have diverse interests, different learning styles, different cultural experiences. All of that needs to be honored and individualized.
So we're talking about creating a system that's both culturally responsive and personalized. That feels like a tall order, but it's clearly essential, right, if we actually want to create a system where all students can thrive. But I'm thinking about all this talk about classrooms and curriculum, and it makes me wonder, where do families fit into all of this vision of culturally sustaining education?
Oh, families are absolutely essential. They're the experts on their children's culture, on their strengths, their needs. We really need to move beyond those, kind of tokenistic gestures of parent involvement and create a system that truly values their voices and their partnerships.
Yeah, the source on cultivating family empowerment in schools, they made a really strong case for family empowerment centers, or FAXEs as they're called. They said those are a critical resource in this effort.
Oh, FX are amazing. They're game changers. They're not just providing information, they're empowering families. They're giving them the tools to navigate the system, to advocate for their children, and to connect with other families who are having similar experiences.
And one thing that I really like about FX is that they often have staff members who come from the same cultural backgrounds as the families they serve. That shared understanding, I think it can just make communication so much easier, builds trust.
Absolutely. When families feel seen and they feel understood, They're more likely to feel comfortable sharing their perspectives, their concerns. It creates a space for real, genuine dialogue and collaboration. And that's essential for building a truly equitable system.
So it's not just about bringing family over to the table. It's about making sure they have a voice at the table, right? And that their voices are actually shaping those decisions that impact their children's lives.
Precisely. And this is where that concept of shared decision making comes in. It's about moving away from that top down approach where educators are the ones holding all the power and creating a more equitable partnership, one where families are really actively involved in developing their children's education plans.
Yeah. It's a reminder that families, they're not just passive recipients of services. They're active agents of change. But even with the best intentions, and even with the most supportive families, how do we ensure that the system itself is actually held accountable for creating lasting change?
That's where data becomes absolutely critical. We can't just implement a bunch of new programs and hope for the best. We need robust data collection and analysis to track progress, to identify those areas where disparities persist, and to hold schools and districts accountable for addressing those disparities.
And it's not enough to just collect data in general, right? It needs to be disaggregated by race, by ethnicity, by disability category, and those other relevant factors. Otherwise, we're just getting a really surface-level view. We're missing those crucial nuances.
Exactly. And that data, it needs to be transparent and accessible to the public. Families, communities, advocates, they all need to be able to see the data, to analyze it, and to use it to hold those systems accountable for creating real, measurable change.
So we're talking about creating a culture of data transparency and accountability, where the data is not just sitting in a report somewhere or gathering dust, but it's actually being used to drive decision-making, to inform policy changes, and to track progress over time.
Precisely. But collecting and analyzing data, that's just one part of the equation. We also need really rigorous research, right? Research to help us understand those complex factors that are contributing to these disparities and to develop evidence-based solutions.
And that research needs to be collaborative, don't you think? Bringing together researchers, educators, families, community members. It can't just be academics in ivory towers studying the problem from a distance.
Absolutely. The most effective solutions are the ones that are grounded in the lived experiences of those who are most affected by the problem. So we need to really value the expertise of families, educators, community members, the ones who are, on the front lines of this issue.
So research is not just about generating knowledge. It's about using that knowledge to inform action, to create real, lasting change. Now, as we wrap up this part of our conversation, I'm kind of left with this feeling of, wow, there's so much work to do, but also this glimmer of hope, knowing that there are solutions out there and that people are fighting for change. How about you?
Oh, I totally share that feeling. This work is complex, it's challenging, and often it's heartbreaking, but it's also incredibly hopeful because within these conversations, within these research findings, within the stories of resilience and advocacy, I think we really find the seeds of a more just and equitable future.
I agree. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's keep those seeds of hope planted firmly in our mind. Let's explore what it means to really move beyond awareness and into action, to translate all this knowledge that we've been talking about into tangible change for Black children with disabilities. Join us for part 3 as we continue this really crucial conversation. Welcome back to our deep dive. As we kind of wrap up this whole conversation, I'm struck by just how much we've learned about all the challenges that Black children with disabilities face. It feels really important to end on a note of action, though, don't you think? Like, what can we actually do with all of this knowledge?
I agree. Awareness is obviously crucial, but it really is just that first step. We have to translate that awareness into concrete action, a collective push for change.
Yeah, for sure. But where do we even begin? I mean, the system just feels so massive. The problems feel so deeply rooted. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all.
Oh, it definitely is daunting. But I think it's important to remember that, systemic change actually starts with individual actions. Each of us has a role to play in this, no matter how small it might seem.
Okay, so give me an example. What's one thing our listener could do today to actually make a difference?
Well, I think a great place to start is to just continue educating yourself on these issues. We've only scratched the surface in this deep dive. There's so many incredible books out there, articles, documentaries, podcasts, all sorts of things that can help deepen your understanding of these really complex issues.
That's true. Knowledge is power, right? So once you have that knowledge, share it. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, your colleagues. Bring these issues into your everyday conversations.
Exactly. The more we talk about these issues, the more we kind of normalize them, and the more likely we are to actually spark change.
And, it's not just about talk, it's about action too, right? Like
Mm.
supporting organizations like Advocating for Kids, donating to family empowerment centers, maybe even volunteering your time. Those are all tangible ways to actually make a difference in the lives of these kids and their families.
Oh, for sure. And don't underestimate the power of your voice. Contact your elected officials, go to school board meetings, advocate for policies that actually promote equity and inclusion. You can make a difference.
Yeah, it's about showing up, speaking out, and demanding better for Black children with disabilities. It's about making sure they're not forgotten or ignored.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember that change doesn't happen overnight. This is a long journey. It's going to be a long one. And there will be setbacks along the way. There will be moments when you feel discouraged or, even despair. But we can't give up hope. We just can't.
Hope is what fuels this work, right? Is what keeps us all going, keeps us pushing forward, even when it feels like an uphill battle.
Exactly. And hope isn't passive, it's active. It requires us to show up every day, day after day, to fight for what's right, to demand better for the people who have been marginalized and silenced for too long.
So for our listener who's been with us on this journey, we've gone through some really heavy stuff. I want to leave you with this final thought. Remember that Capitol crawl we talked about? Those individuals who were crawling up the steps of the Capitol, they were fueled by hope. They were demanding change, and they ultimately helped to bring about the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yeah. Their story is such a powerful reminder that even in the face of, a seemingly insurmountable obstacles, change is possible. But it requires us to be persistent, to be vocal, to never, ever give up on the fight for justice and equality.
I think that's a perfect note to end on this whole deep dive. It's been about shining a light on the injustices that are faced by Black children with disabilities. But it's also been about igniting a spark, a call to action. We each have the power to make a difference. Let's not let that spark fade.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We really hope that it's inspired you to learn more, to speak out, and to be a part of the solution. Because together, I really believe we can create a world where all children, regardless of their race or disability, have the opportunity to truly thrive.